Hey, so I've been thinking, what are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 1, being the very first one, has a lot of really meaningful contenders for the title. Luffy's first Gum Gum pistol is an obvious one, setting the tone for One Piece's battles with its mixture of goofy and badass. Plus, goddamn, even in Chapter 1, Oda knew how to do an epic splash page. And I also like this panel where Lucky Roo shoots a mountain bandit in the head. This, too, is a major tone setter for the series, driving home the seriousness and danger of pirate life. The story up to this point mostly plays as a fairly lighthearted comedy, and seeing the jolly cartoon fat guy casually murder a man shocks the audience a little bit. Despite the cartoony art style, One Piece isn't just a kid-friendly pirate adventure. But the crown has to go to the passing of the straw hat from Shanks to Luffy. It's a panel that's only ever taken on more meaning as the story has gone on, and the symbol of the straw hat has taken on more and more importance. It represents the promise between Luffy and Shanks to meet again. Shanks recognizes Luffy as an equal, and it's a passing of the torch. That straw hat means something, and Shanks is passing it on to someone who he feels is a worthy heir to all of that meaning. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 2 is all about establishing Luffy's character now that he's grown up, and especially the scale of the odds that he's up against. What does his dream of being the king of the pirates really mean? And this is where Oda shows skill not just as an action and comedy artist, but as a storyteller. He introduces Koby the Cap'n Boy, a character who mostly exists to be the opposite of Luffy. He's scared, self-defeating, and cowardly, and even his body language is Luffy's direct opposite. When Luffy says he'll be king of the pirates, Oda drops the angle down low, playing Luffy's chill, unaffected sitting posture against Koby's shouting. His arms are wide, foreshortening even out of the panel as the nervous boy tries to communicate the jaw-dropping scale of what Luffy has said he will accomplish. Don't tell me you're after the One Piece! We feel the weight of Koby's astonishment here, the monumental nature of what Luffy has promised to do. The One Piece isn't a silly bedtime story for children in this world, it's a real thing, and to go after it is to march to an almost certain death. The fact that Luffy is so casual about it because he has accepted death is not normal. Luffy is not normal, and Oda establishes this fact visually through the acting in every interaction that he has with Koby. So I've been wondering, what are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 3 introduces us to Zoro with this amazing panel, which, given how much of a martyr he is for the crew and Luffy all throughout One Piece, wow, what a hell of an establishing shot. But it also establishes one of the great running themes of One Piece, which is the abuse of power and the value of freedom. Helmeppo lords his status as a Navy fail-son over the townsfolk, abusing his position and his status in a way that we'll see villains in One Piece do over and over again. And Luffy does what Luffy will always do to those who use their power in this way. When he learns that Helmeppo lied to Zoro, let him believe that he would go free if he could survive a month tied up, only to plan an execution behind his back, this happens. There are many reasons One Piece is a fun and satisfying narrative to follow. Oda's dynamic and exciting art is a big one for me, but the thing I love the most might be the vicious delight that the story takes in showing us the ruling classes getting the ass-kicking they so richly deserve. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 4 gives us perhaps one of the weakest villain designs in the series, which is Axe Hand Morgan. His obsession with power and control foreshadows many of One Piece's best villains, but oh boy, it's not Oda's best character design. On a better note, though, we're getting one of the most important recurring story beats in the narrative, which is the effect that Luffy has on people around him. Koby, who not 2 chapters ago was a cowering, appeasing little wretch of a person, now walks into the execution grounds to free Zoro because he just can't stand to see the Navy oppressing people this way. He accepted his abuse from Alvida, but now, no more. Luffy changes the people around him, and the most important thing he does is set them free of their fear. He teaches people to pursue their freedom, even if it costs them their lives. He'll do this many times throughout the story, and Koby won't be the last person who almost dies to chase the dream that Luffy has kindled in him. What are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 5, the obvious choice might be Luffy taking bullets for his friends in the nick of time, which is a very Luffy thing to do, but I think the best panel is something much quieter. We get a flashback to Zoro's backstory and his rivalry with childhood friend and sword-fighting prodigy Kuina, who is idly one of the most transmasculine characters I've ever seen. The panel that strikes me the most in this chapter, though, is this one. It's just a little transitional panel of Kuina lying there dead with the words, "Humans are fragile things," Zoro hovering above. Oda uses cross-hatching to just barely hint at the eye sockets underneath the cloth that otherwise erases Kuina's face, erasing identity, erasing life. It's such a quiet and disquieting panel, such a matter-of-fact reminder of cold mortality in the middle of all Zoro's hot-blooded shouting. It's a death that's so meaningless, and Zoro, in taking Kuina's swords with him, is trying desperately to make it meaningful. If he becomes the greatest swordsman in the world, then everyone will know that Kuina was his greatest rival. And I think that's the same reason so many One Piece fans want Tashiki to turn out to be Kuina in the end, because the idea that people can just vanish from life so coldly and so pointlessly, it's a scary thought to have. What are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 6, the easy answer, I guess, is the big epic Oda splash page of the Gum Gum Whip taking out a dozen Marines, but no, you know it has to be the introduction of the three-sword style. Zoro with his cool bandana and his intense looks and his tragic backstory, and there he is with a sword in his mouth. This is the power of One Piece, because on the one hand, this is stupid, this is objectively dumb. Holding a sword in your mouth is dumb, this looks dumb, it doesn't work, it's cartoon nonsense, and it doesn't make any goddamn sense. And on the other hand, this totally rules. Oda presents it so perfectly with that hunched-over power pose, blocking 10 swords at once and the black bandana over his head. It's so cool! Although I'll never forgive the Wiz Media translators for covering up this much of the art with sound effects. You miss the rope still falling from his body and the scabbard still in the air because Zoro unsheathed them so fast. Still, it all adds up to a panel that bypasses every critical neuron in my brain and speaks to the primal, stupid lizard and monkey part of my man brain that goes, "Oh, 3 swords, cool!" And nobody does that like Oda does. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 7 sees our first parting of ways, with Kobe remaining behind to enlist in the Marines. It's mostly an exposition chapter, a cooldown from all the action with Axe Hand Morgan, but Oda once again uses what could be boring exposition to do good character building. Because Luffy and Zoro are pirates, they can't stay in a navy town, and as they leave, Luffy begins to spill the beans on how Kobe was a cabin boy for a pirate too, which might ruin his chances to enlist. And Kobe, until then, desperately torn up about saying goodbye to his first real friend, punches Luffy to shut him up, which proves that Kobe isn't with them, isn't a pirate, so he can enlist. It's the first moment Kobe fully asserts himself. It's the first punch he ever throws for his dream as a Marine, but it's also a moment of revelation. However simple-minded Luffy seems, so straightforward and oblivious, here he reveals a deep understanding, not only of other people, but the things that they need, the push they need to find their courage. He pushes Kobe's buttons to force him to commit to his dream, to force him to renounce piracy, and when Kobe does that, Luffy couldn't be more proud of him, and maybe a little smug. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 8 is the introduction of Nami, and what an introduction it is. Oda pulls a clever move narratively separating Luffy and Zoro. Zoro, and thus the audience, learn from some pirates that he picks up that Nami is a devious swindler, but Luffy encounters her separately and doesn't know that, which means that we as an audience are predisposed to distrust her, but Luffy can meet her with no prejudice. This allows him to demonstrate his honest nature to her, which will become important to their relationship. But the best panel in the chapter, right? It's not a chapter with obvious bangers in the panel department. The introduction of Buggy's ship is a quite little technical masterpiece of character design, but it doesn't really relate to the story that much. No, I think it's this one. Nami is trying to strike up a partnership with Luffy after using him to take care of her pursuers, and it's a great bit of compositional storytelling. She's perched above him, literally looking down on him, as she gears up to try and use him once again. She's in a position of power over him and removed from him, which makes it hard visually to trust her and sets up a dynamic between her and Luffy that won't actually be fully resolved until over 70 chapters later. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 9 finally sees the introduction of Buggy, who is a massive improvement as a villain over Axe Hand Morgan. He has a gimmick, he has a solid, consistent theme, clowns and pirates kind of work together aesthetically, and by the way, anyone who says he doesn't deserve to be an Emperor of the Sea is dumb and wrong. Buggy is the best. But here, our perfect idiot boy is being introduced as one of the first major villains, which means we need to build up his menace. So, we get this introduction. Man spreading on a throne whose crown looks like the top of a circus tent, all gangster energy and dressed in an opulent fur-lined coat, and that does do a pretty good job of making him look cool and dangerous. But the menace happens on the next page, here. As he walks away from the explosion of his cannon blasting one of his own crewmates to cinders, he's illuminated in stark black and white shadows, giving his face a horribly evil look, while his form is hidden in the deep shadow of that cape. He may be a clown, but here, for just a second, he looks truly demonic. Yeah, Buggy might turn out to be an ineffective idiot, but this panel sells him so well as a villain. What are the best panels in One Piece? Well, Chapter 10 is honestly full of bangers on that account. We've got a classic Oda pirate party scene, which are always some of the most fun stuff to look at, absolutely bursting with life. Then we have wild technical masterpieces like the blast from the Buggy Bowl, folding an entire row of houses up like paper. Like, I don't think I can overstate how impressive it is to do this kind of creatively distorted technical artwork. It's really hard. Then there's also moments like Nami literally scorching her own hands to save the life of someone she insists repeatedly that she hates and doesn't care about, which is a fantastically revealing character moment for her. But no, the best panel by far the most striking one is this Buggy face. Oda cross-hatches all these ominous shadows onto him, making him look like he's lit from below, and there's such a striking contrast between the cheerful clown makeup trying to drag his face into a smile and that murderous, contemptuous, cruel grimace. All the folds and lines of his face are converging to communicate the reality of the situation here. It's a loyalty test. Either Nami kills Luffy, or Buggy kills Nami. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 11 features a cavalcade of truly excellent Buggy faces. His clown makeup and nose work together so naturally with Oda's hyper-exaggerated style, and I find them all just so charming. But no, there's no contention for the best panel of this chapter. It's this. It's Zoro doing what he will always do for the Straw Hat crew, shouldering the burden even at the cost of his own life. This panel really encapsulates everything of what Zoro is. His incredible feats of strength, his utter dependability, and the total trust between him and Luffy, all underpinned by his constant propensity for self-sacrifice. There's no pain Zoro won't take on for his friends, there's no hurt he won't go through, and if his guts spill out of his stomach for doing it, he says he'll just shove them back in again, even though that doesn't make any goddamn sense. That's just the kind of vice captain he is. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 12 is another exposition dump. The plot beat of these chapters is all about developing Luffy and Zoro's relationship with Nami, showing her that piracy isn't just a means to abuse people, but a means to claim freedom, which is very important to her. And this is done partly through Shushu, the silly-looking ultra-loyal dog protecting his beloved master's pet food store. Visually, all the big impactful panels are given to Moji and Richie, with Oda having a lot of fun over-rendering the lion, but honestly, I think the best panels might be these two. Shushu grabbing the key to Luffy's cage and then eating it. It's such an out-of-left-field comedy moment, it's so silly and dumb, and it is done so matter-of-factly by this very silly-looking dog. Shushu eats the key because he's actually literally starving himself to death by staying by the store, of course, but it's such a blindsiding comedy moment. All the drama and danger of escaping Buggy's crew and Nami stealing the key, and then the dog just goes chomp and the key is gone. Not that it matters, Moji gets Luffy out of the cage anyway, it's just Oda gleefully trolling the reader, and I do respect that. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 13 only really has two contenders. The first is Luffy confronting Moji after he has burned down Chushu's store. Luffy opens with his big trademark goofy grin and maintains that attitude while swinging Richie around, and then he drops the mask and we see the genuinely frightening person he becomes when he's confronted by rank injustice. It's the first time in the series that we see this side of Luffy, and it hits, although, once again, translators, please stop covering up the art with sound effects, oh my god. Speaking of which, the actual best panel in the chapter is this one. Oda and his team worked really hard to render the stark awfulness of Shushu's store burning down, but I guess Wiz Media really wanted that big foosh on there blocking out all the art. Still, this is a great rendition of heartbreak. This tiny dog way too close to the fire, lit up by its glow, just barking out its anger and pain at the flames. A tiny little thing, powerless against the tragedy that's been done to it. If you don't engage with Shushu's story, obviously this probably rings hollow to you, but if you do engage with it, then, ow. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 14 is another exposition dump, all about establishing the stakes for the mayor and giving the audience a reason to care about Orange Town and its buildings. It's all world building, establishing the very real danger and menace that pirates pose to ordinary people. Nami doesn't hate them just for no reason, and we kinda need that perspective to see things from her point of view and understand why she instinctively seems to hate Luffy so much. And for my money, the best panel here is this one, with the mayor's face in profile and a montage of moments from the building of the town arranged in floating images. It does a fantastic job of visually showing him gazing into the past, remembering all these moments from his life so vividly that they come to life before his eyes. Flashbacks and exposition is hard to do in an engaging way, and here Oda gets the whole thing out of the way in a single page so we can get back to the more interesting action, and he does it by using good visual shorthand just like this. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 15 is the lead-up to the big fight with Buggy, and this chapter is all about setting the stage. It introduces Kabaji, who will be fighting Zoro, it reminds us of Buggy's powers and his cruelty, and it establishes his ideological position. Buggy believes that the only treasure worth caring about is gold and jewels, and that only money and power matters, while the mayor stands for the idea that anything can be a treasure if it means something to you, which is also Luffy's position. That's why he asked the Straw Hat, after all. But the story is also still in the process of establishing Luffy's character, so Oda has him crack an old man's head into a wall, because if he was conscious, he would just get in the way, and this is the most straightforward way to keep him safe, as it were. And this is the best panel in the chapter because it does establish something important about Luffy, how brutal he can be, even when he's technically trying to do a kind-hearted thing. Luffy does not feel bad about doing this. at all. He will enact great violence even on his friends, so long as he believes that it's the right thing to do. What are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 16, the first major crew versus crew battle of the series finally kicks off, and thus there's a solid few contenders for the title of Best Panel. There's Kabaji and Buggy shielding themselves with their own crewmates, which is an excellent evil boss move, really establishes their menace. Then there's really satisfying panels like Luffy kicking Moji in the head. This is just a really good composition. Or Zoro staring down Kabaji across the edge of his own blade with that heavy shadow from his bandana really intensifying his stare. But let's be real, the best panel is this one. Not just because Zoro injuring himself is a shocking moment, but because of the storytelling that's being done. Look at the sweat pouring off him. Look at the tremble in his body as he cuts himself. It's such an idiot machismo moment, the kind of behavior that'll eventually make Chopper very mad at him, but it's also... yeah, it's very him. It establishes the lengths that Zoro is willing to go to preserve his swordsman's honor. It establishes that he's every bit as chaotic and extreme as his captain is. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 17 concludes the duel between Zoro and Kabaji, and Oda's storytelling shows perhaps a bit of unexpected subtlety here. Throughout the entire fight, Kabaji is constantly doing circus tricks. He's breathing fire, kicking up dust clouds, throwing spinning tops around, and somewhat impressively, unicycling up the sides of buildings. Zoro, meanwhile, injured, spends most of the fight basically stationary, mostly just responding to Kabaji's moves and staying on the defensive. That is, until he gets tired of the game, reads his opponent, and ends the entire duel in a single strike. It's a brilliant way to establish the difference between a posturing amateur like Kabaji who relies on tricks and distractions and a real swordsman like Zoro. It's a very well-told fight. And the best panel of the fight, I think, is this one, where Zoro just casually kicks Kabaji off his unicycle. It's the casualness of the gesture that works so well. He knocks the guy off with basically the demeanor of someone kicking a can down the road. It establishes the difference between them and the fact that if Zoro had not been injured ahead of time, this wouldn't even have been a fight. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 18 begins the big fight between Luffy and Buggy, and like many of Oda's action chapters, it's got a bunch of really solid action shots. I'm personally quite fond of Buggy popping his head off to dodge Luffy's gum sickle just because of that big, huge, dumb grin on his face. There's also this panel where Luffy takes his first real injury of the series, both physically and mentally. As we discussed, the conflict between Luffy and Buggy here is in part over the question of what can and cannot be a treasure, with Buggy representing the belief that only money is treasure. For Luffy, the hat and what it represents is his treasure, and here Buggy manages to injure him spiritually, and Luffy takes that very seriously. But the best panel still does have to be this. Oda knows how to draw a goddamn hit, and he puts it all to work right here. All the cross-hatching follows the direction of action, emphasizing the power of the move, almost washing the characters out with the sheer speed and power of it. And Oda renders the anatomy of the characters realistically here to really drive home the seriousness of the attack. And then there's the Buggy face, of course, those popping eyes. That's pure One Piece. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 19 sees us taking a break in the middle of the fight to give Buggy some backstory. It doesn't do much for the fight itself in the moment, but, well, 20 years later it turned out to give a lot of context to a major character in the story. One Piece is like that a lot. It also re-emphasizes the clash in values that the story is establishing. Shanks and Buggy have stark differences in what they believe piracy is about, with Buggy being all about the money and Shanks articulating a romantic vision of freedom. But both of them agree that they're willing to die for the vision of piracy that they believe in. It establishes an interesting dynamic between them that will come back, again, literally decades later because One Piece. The best panel, though? This one. That silent little joke beat between the moment when Shanks startled Buggy into swallowing the devil fruit and then them reacting to it. It's so simple, it's so cutesy, it's just this little frozen moment in time surrounded by a white void. It gives the joke just that little moment to land that it needs, that makes it genuinely quite funny when Buggy freaks the hell out in the very next panel. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 20 is the end of the fight with Buggy, and for me, more than anything, this is the chapter of the Buggy face. His character design uses his clown makeup wonderfully with Oda's already extremely exaggerated faces, and this chapter is just full of bangers. We also get a fantastic action shot of Luffy launching Buggy with a Gum bazooka, and this fantastically composed shot of Buggy's upper body collapsing after a crotch shot from Luffy. Look how dynamic this is with that fisheye lens effect applied. That's kind of a technical shot to do just for this. But the best panel is still the Buggy face. Specifically, it's this panel where Luffy tickles his feet and he does this face. Oda twists and deforms his jawline and his whole head, and Nami's terrified reaction just makes it that much better. And be honest, you'd piss yourself too if a clown face came floating at you laughing like that. One Piece's cartoony expressiveness, I know, isn't for everyone, but goddammit, it is for me. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 21 is the denouement of the Orange Town arc, wrapping up all the narrative stakes and letting the Straw Hats engage in their favorite activity, which is running away when people try to thank them for toppling a tyrant. And it also introduces us to one of Luffy's funniest traits, which is telling the truth even when that's a very bad idea. But Mayor Boodle gets the starring role here, waking up and becoming incandescently upset both that Luffy knocked him out and that the Straw Hats are trying to run away before he can thank them for doing that. And I love how Oda does his acting here. As he rushes to the docks, he quite awkwardly sheds all of his battle gear, pulling it off to go faster, and taking off the armor like that is symbolically a representation of the fact that he's realizing that he's safe now, that the town is safe, that he doesn't have to be angry and fight anymore. And so when he gets there without his armor, all the anger falls away from him, and everything that's left is just joy and gratitude. It's a great sequence, and this panel is the best one of them. I love the way that he's awkwardly pulling off everything as he runs. It's such good acting. What are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 22 is a complete side story. Unusually for One Piece, nothing that happens here comes back to be a critically important plot point 2 decades later, and that self-containedness serves this story pretty well. It is a fairly low-stakes personal emotional drama involving a single character. It's well-balanced, and Oda does work in a little bit of world-building geography to establish the world and the menace of the Grand Line, so it's all good stuff. Gaimon is the main character for this side narrative, and he also gets the best panels. A highlight for me is his stubby little chest body taking off running like that, but he also gets some really good acting and body language, which is hard with a design like that. Oda gives him these really evocative hand gestures, and of course, when it is revealed that his treasure is empty and he has wasted 20 years of his life guarding it, he gets the emotional climax panel of the story. And despite him being a weird little treasure chest goblin, Oda sells it. The lines on his forehead, the clenching, and again, the hand gestures. The emotionality lands, and that's hard to do with a character like this. One of Oda's greatest talents is bringing emotionality from even his silliest cartoon characters. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 23 sees the introduction of Usopp, who, wow, remember when his nose and eyes used to be this small? Huh. Most of the action is about introducing him and endearing him to the audience by showing us his shenanigans, all his comedy cowardice, his ridiculous lying, and his trusty crew of village kids who look up to him. But it also hints a bit of the bravery that Usopp can display when he stands his ground and lies to the Straw Hats, despite clearly being pretty scared. It shows us that Usopp is someone who, when backed into a corner, has the guts to at least go for something, to swing for the fences in desperation, and it's a trait that will save his life many times over the next 25 years. But the best panel, I think, doesn't even have Usopp in it. It's right near the end with Kaya in her mansion. It is a bright, airy, mostly pure white space with barely any shadows anywhere, which suits her as a frail, pure-hearted maiden sort of character. And then in the background there is the stark, pure black shadow of Klahadore looming behind her. It's unsettling. He looks out of place and ominous. And that, kids, is good visual foreshadowing. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 24, we get to meet the villain of this arc properly, Klahadore, or spoiler alert, Captain Kuro of the Black Cat Pirates, and the chapter is mostly about establishing his character, especially as a counterpoint to Usopp. Usopp is an honest man who presents himself as a liar, while Kuro is a liar presenting himself as an honest man. They make good foils for one another. This panel in particular is a great microcosm of the story. On the one side, Usopp and all his friends, on the other, Kuro alone, and caught between them, Kaya, the person whose trust they're fighting over. Speaking of Kaya, she also gets a pretty good panel here when she has her first outburst. See how Oda applies a fisheye lens, bending the window around her, shouting, emphasizing it? It's just really good comic technique. But no, the best panel is the punch. It's the first time we see the otherwise easygoing Usopp use violence, but it's also just a gorgeously dynamic shot. Look at that foreshortening. And then the clever little trick of extending the line of his punch through the strap of his bag. It really emphasizes the motion, and it just looks great on the page. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 25 is one of those chapters that feels even darker in hindsight, opening with Kaya questioning Kuro about why he tries to isolate her from her friends and why he keeps making her feel guilty about it. He then wheels out his fake sad backstory and turns it around on her that he's only acting this way because he cares about her so much, play-acting emotional anguish to make her feel guilty, which gets her to back off. It is the textbook dynamic of an abusive caretaker relationship, and it's really dark in hindsight. That said, it's not a chapter with any clear standout panels. Arguably, it doesn't need any. It's not a bombastic chapter. Nothing needs to be high impact here. Since I have to pick, I quite like this one where Zoro and Nami are sitting with the village kids because of the way that Zoro is sitting exactly like the kids while Nami is up on the fence by contrast. It's really cute, but you know, although it's a bit flat, this panel of Usopp sitting on a cliff looking out over the ocean, the way that his head rises just above the horizon line, that sense of how he's drawn to the sea, that's pretty good too. That has some vibes, even if it's not technically very impressive. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 26 opens with some awkward exposition, a classic characters telling each other what they both already know situation, which is efficient if inelegant. It gets Kuro's real motivation established quickly and sets the stakes, but it's a janky way to storytell. Oda does a visually clever little callback, repeating the exact same set of 3 panels for Usopp's now terrified truth-telling as he used when he was telling his prank lies. And it's a bit funny because you can see here, Usopp's character design is already changing a mere 3 chapters after his introduction. The nose and the eyes are getting bigger. It's another chapter without any real standout panels, though. Nothing that really rises above the rest. Usopp's terrified face when he realizes what Kuro is up to is good, as are his horrified reactions at Luffy's brashness, but if I have to pick, and I do, it's probably this one. It's not exceptional, but there's a subtlety of despair underneath the cartoony art style that comes through in the furrowed lines on his brows, the squeeze around the cheeks up under the eyes. If you look at it for a little bit, you do feel his desperation, and that is emotionally important at this moment in the story. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 27, the action finally kicks up, and Usopp's fight with the guards at Kaya's mansion is a standout little sequence. Usopp diving out of the way of a gun while loading and firing his slingshot is dynamic as hell, albeit, Jesus Christ, they're pulling guns on a teenager pretty casually here. What are these guys, American cops? I quite like this panel when Usopp realizes that he has no chance to convince anyone that he's finally telling the truth. The use of a screen tone to have a shadow literally pass over his face sells the feeling really well, along with that raised posture barely holding back the pain. This moment when he's hiding his injured arm from his friends and lying to keep them out of danger is also good, but the killer panel comes at the end, where Usopp is holding up his bleeding arm and declaring that they can shoot him and chase him and hurt him, but he loves the village and he will fight for it. It is the moment that Usopp really becomes a hero in the story, but equally importantly, it's also the moment that he becomes a Straw Hat. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 28, we get Kuro's dramatic villain reveal finally setting his plan into motion, and consequently, he also gets the best panels. His glasses keep slipping down, and he keeps having to conspicuously adjust them with his palm, so Kaya has bought him a pair of special glasses that will sit stably on his face. It's a very thoughtful gift, and the kind of thing that even if he's planning to betray her, would just be useful. He might as well keep them. But he throws them on the ground and crushes them. He reacts like they're an insult. He wants everything, and he wants to take it himself. It is a total rejection of his relationship with Kaya, and it is the perfect demonstration of his cruelty. You see it fully in this panel, with the gift ground underneath his foot and his own glasses shining like demon eyes inside of a deep shadow. This is how much of a piece of shit this guy is. This is how petty he is. This is how greedy he is. Kuro is ultimately only a minor villain in One Piece, and he never returns later, but it's characterization like this that makes it so satisfying to see villains like him get their asses handed to them. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 29 opens on a really strong panel. Usopp alone at the hill facing down the Black Cat pirates. It's a great dramatic opening and a reminder that he was never actually a coward. He just gets scared, and those aren't the same thing. This chapter has a lot of fantastic action panels, like this shot of Usopp taking a blow to the head, or Nami saving Usopp and then blocking that sword stroke. You can really see how overmatched she is just from the posture and the composition of the panel, and the way that the staff is buckling under the pressure. But the best panel still goes to Usopp, clinging on to the belt of a pirate, dripping in blood and unwilling, even at the cost of his life, to let them go. He cuts, in this posture, both quite a pathetic, but also a profoundly heroic figure. These are the sorts of moments that define the Straw Hats as heroes, and Usopp will have his share of them as the adventure goes on. Poor guy. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Well, let's not mess about. In Chapter 30, it is absolutely the Gum Gum Gatling gun and its debut. The sense of scale here, the converging action, the way that Oda hatches speed lines into the geometry of every hand to give it weight and momentum, while still making sure that every line hatched follows the line of action. It's just so freaking good. The pirates who are the targets are tiny pinpricks on the page against the overwhelming force of Luffy's assault. One glance at this panel, and you know instinctively the kind of power he's unleashing. Now, there are other good panels too, like the follow-up, where the entire panel is a chaos of sound effects and crashing bodies, all framing Luffy as the stable's center, the literal last man standing. And the panel where the pirates get hypnotized and spring back to life has a lot of charm to it as well. One of Oda's less talked about skills is how good he is at drawing a lively panel full of characters doing things in interesting poses. But yeah, no, the Gum Gum Gatling gun is the best one. God damn, this panel is good. What a way to introduce a special move. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 31 sees Kaya finally discovering Captain Kuro's villainy, and one of the quite good panels in this chapter is the discovery of Mary's bloodied body. The body itself is in the foreground, rendered in rock-solid flat black, while the entire background is scratched and indistinct, drawing our eye to the shocking sight that we're meant to focus on. But I think the best panel is a quieter thing. One of the key traits of Kaya is that she's sickly, she's frail and vulnerable. The threat that she's under is the source of a lot of dramatic tension for this entire arc. She's about to exert herself a lot trying to save the village and her friends, and so this chapter spends quite a bit of time establishing just how hard that is for her, how much she struggles with what she's about to do. And this panel, where she's hunched over, the sweat of fever drenching her body, idly clutching the blanket around her and her hair falling all over her face, yeah, that's what that's like, being sick and feeling alone, clammy, clenched, and claustrophobic. That hunched over, defeated posture, that's what it feels like to be in that kind of misery. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Oh man, I don't like the Nyanban brothers. They're on the F list of Oda's character designs, and their fight with Zoro just isn't very interesting. In fact, the whole chapter is kind of mid when it comes to the art, if I'm honest. The Nyanban brothers' designs don't lend themselves very well to dynamism, and some of these compositions feel really rather rushed, which maybe they were. Working for Shonen Jump is a pretty relentless gig. Whatever the reason, though, it does mean the chapter is light on banger panels. Zoro's slash through Siam here gives him a gorgeous action posture, and the brothers do get one good dynamic action panel when they smack Zoro to the ground here, but yeah. No, my pick for a best panel is more of a technical accomplishment. It's this one, of Zoro shouting angrily at Usopp for trying to interfere. It's shown from below Zoro's body, hunched over to the ground, using him to frame the people that he's shouting at in the background, which is a genuinely really clever way to show both his posture and the desperation of his situation, show visually who he's shouting at, and communicate the geography of how far they are from each other, which is going to matter when Nami runs for his swords in just a little bit. It's a very good use of composition. Which are the best panels in One Piece? For Chapter 33, I'm tempted to say the title page because goddamn, look at those airplanes, but let's stick to the rules. We're still cursed with having to look at the Nyanban brothers every few panels, which rather hampers the quality of the chapter, but Zoro's tiger hunt does make for a compelling splash. It takes a lot of confidence from an artist to render the entire head of a character merely as a flat blob of black, but it works because the posture and the gesture are so clear. The foreshortening on the swords and the splash of blood coming off one of the blades in an arc, it all gives the image such a sense of dynamic motion. It's excellent. But no, the best panel actually has the Nyanbans in it. It's this one. Kuro with those casual arms over their shoulders, digging the point of a knife into Butchie's neck. It's such a casual and even almost intimate interaction, but he's not even looking at where he's drawing blood. It's a demonstration of confidence, control, and cruelty, and Siam's terrified expression really helps sell the horror of it all. Kuro's furry gloves might be objectively quite silly, but goddamn if this doesn't make them look scary. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 34 sees the confrontation between Kuro and Kaya now that she knows his true nature, and her dramatic appearance panel is a strong composition. Kaya's expressions, as she begins to realize how truly evil Kuro is, are damn good as well, and Usopp charging in for a punch here looks genuinely kinda terrifying, actually. But no, the best panel is this particular punch, and not because it's the world's most compelling drawing of a punch, it's not, it's really just a flat white surface with hatched edges foreshortening into the screen. No, it's because of what the punch does. Look at how Kuro is rendered here. One panel previously, he was all Omae wa mu shindeiru, a solid black specter of doom. But here, pow! Luffy literally punches the solidity out of him. The scratchy rendering not only shows us the motion of his knockback, visually Luffy is also breaking his spell. Kuro, up until now, had been this terrifying, untouchable Grim Reaper, hovering over everything, promising to murder everyone in 5 minutes, domineering and shadowy. But with this punch, with this scratchy rendering, suddenly, we all know what Luffy knows. He's not untouchable. He can be beaten. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 35 is an interstitial chapter all about transitioning from the fight with the Black Cat crew into the real fight with Captain Kuro and establishing who's up against who. As such, it's a fairly light chapter in terms of meaningful action. It's all just chess pieces moving into position for the real showdowns, but I do have a lot of fondness for Onion, Pepper, and Carrot charging at the prone Captain Kuro here. There's such a sense of childish chaos to their attack with their crudely drawn weapons. It just has a lot of charm, while visually immediately communicating how ineffective they're actually about to be. The best panel, though, I think is Usopp here on the ground and so exhausted that he can't move, telling his friends to protect Kaya. There's something in his expression, staring straight at the viewer with his eyes wide open under the goggles, that sells the determination and authority with which he gives the order. Oda renders his face quite carefully here, subtle shading under the nose in particular. He grants Usopp just that slight bit of air of seriousness that informs how we read the words coming out of his mouth, and while that's not some kind of genius masterstroke, it's just good comic craft, it's visual storytelling. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 36, the climactic battles finally kick off for real, with the village kids playing an escape game from Django, Luffy fighting Kuro, and Zoro finishing off the last Nianban brother. And as such, this chapter is rich in action shot bangers. Luffy dodging Kuro's swipe here looks genuinely fantastic, even if the Viz Media translators once again just had to block a quarter of the artwork with goddamn sound effects. And I do have a special fondness for Zoro's grappling maneuver to put Butchie on the ground here. It's such an effective technical maneuver, and Oda renders it so cleanly you can really feel the action of how he does it. But no, the best panel of the chapter is this one. It's Luffy threatening the Black Cat pirates after they laugh at Usopp. Laugh at Usopp again and I'll kill you. It's not his most intense expression ever, but it's the way his eyes, which are normally a solid black, are suddenly lit up from the inside. It's yet another one of those reminders that we are lucky that Luffy is as kind as he is, because if he wasn't, the intensity of his drive and his willpower would make something truly terrifying out of him. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 37 continues Luffy's duel with Kuro while taking a brief interruption to do more exposition for him, and much like previously in this arc, I feel like this is a little bit awkward and unnecessary. This digression doesn't really tell us anything new about his character that we didn't know already, but we do get some backstory for Axe Hand Morgan, which, hey, that's something. It does have a couple of high-impact panels showing Kuro after massacring the Marines on the boat pursuing him, framing him in black against the crescent moon to heighten his menace, which, again, at this point we already know how cruel and murderous this man is, so it doesn't really tell us anything new or useful. No, for storytelling, I think this panel is much better. Kuro wants out of the pirate life because he's sick of being chased by Marines. That is his petty justification for his cruelty, and I do like having Django and Kuro so casually discussing these things in his cabin while things are falling over from the cannonball impacts around them. It shows visually what a normal part of pirate life it is to be hunted, and that does some storytelling and some world building beyond just Kuro. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 38 sees Kuro revealing that he planned all along to execute his own crew to cover up his plan, and he puts that promise into motion by blindly slaughtering everything and everyone around him. And there is a great panel of Luffy here, seeing Kuro murdering his own crew, and even as he himself takes a brutal slice across the chest, he doesn't flinch from it because he's just so outraged and shocked by Kuro's betrayal of his own men. But the best panel, I think, actually goes to Django and Kaya, as Django is trying to force her to write a will, leaving all her money to Kuro. She refuses to be hypnotized, so Django tries to force her eyes open, and the framing and art of this panel absolutely sells the abusiveness of that action. He's looming over her, this solid black overwhelming shape forcing his hands into her face, and even the tree that she's up against is bending backwards against the way that he's forcing himself into her space. And yeah, that's what it feels like to have someone force themselves on you like that. This drawing evokes that emotional experience absolutely perfectly. This panel might not be the most important one to the story, but it's just damn well executed art. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 39 is the climax, the conclusion of the dramas that have been building up to this point. It is that satisfying moment at the end of a One Piece story when the villains are finally beaten, and it does deliver on that front. Kaya is forced to surrender to Django. She writes the fake will and is nearly about to be killed when Usopp arrives and gets him with a 360 no-scope. And it's a spectacular rendering of that too, that full foreshortening on Django's body as it falls backwards, the speed lines all converging on his head, Kaya cowering from the explosion. It's a great composition. But ultimately, the prize has to go to the Gum Gum Bell. Luffy stretching his neck all the way back to yell at the Black Cat pirates, and then absolutely power slamming Kuro with a headbutt looks perfect. It looks incredibly powerful, to the point that Kuro's body quite literally breaks here. And I mean break in the sense of a cartoon breaking its model, distorting past what is physically possible in order to sell the impact of an action. It's very, very Looney Tunes cartoon vibes, which, given what we now know about Luffy, Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 40 begins the wrap-up after the defeat of Kuro, with his iconic glasses clattering to the ground as his plan is finally shattered. The glasses are a symbolic stand-in for his perspective in intellectualism, and it makes a good panel to wrap the battle up on. But I'm gonna cheat a little bit with this chapter, because the best panel isn't one panel, it's a spread, and it comes at the very end of the chapter. Usopp has decided to go off to sea to finally pursue his dream, and as he breaks up his little pretend pirate band, he tells his friends to shout their dreams out loud as an oath to one another to stay true to them. We get 4 panels pushed in close on their faces, filling the frames with their overwhelming emotion at the parting, cartoony though it is. And then one big panel that pulls back and shows them all as very small, dwarfed by the enormity of the world that surrounds them. Oda literally curves the earth beneath them just to emphasize this. 4 tiny people shouting their dreams into the vast and empty sky. It's a juxtaposition with a lot of pathos. I think you feel in that moment the loneliness that always comes with a big farewell. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 41, we leave Syrup Village behind, and after the introduction of my beloved Going Merry, we also get a bit of sad backstory for Usopp that he started compulsively lying because he simply couldn't face the idea of his mother dying. And so the story moves into the final denouement for this arc, and it's a really good one, I think. In the previous chapter, it was shown that the villagers kind of miss Usopp when he's not running through town shouting about pirates every morning. They miss the ritual of it, the space that he occupies in their lives. For all that they complained, he really did bring excitement to a dull little town. So as Usopp finally sails away to become a great warrior of the sea, his former crew get together and they know just what to do. As they run through town screaming Usopp's pirate lies, we see that he has left his spirit behind in them. He's leaving his home, but his home will never truly be without him. And a lot of the pathos in One Piece is often about this, the echoes people leave in the lives of those they care for. Hey, sorry to interrupt, but if you've watched this compilation this far, I figure you might not mind sitting through a minute of self-promotion on my part. So, The Best Panels of One Piece is a fun series to make, but it also consistently underperforms quite badly in the numbers compared to the rest of my shorts. This is fine, not every kind of content is for every kind of person, and I don't mind making something niche, but I do also have to pay my rent, so if you enjoy these One Piece shorts, maybe consider kicking me a tip on coffee or signing up for a subscription on Patreon. You can also use the memberships on this channel, which will get you early access to the shorts that I upload. I tend to make them faster than I post them, and if you want to see them as fast as I can make them, well, memberships are there for that. A single dollar direct donation can be the same as thousands of views on a short, so if you have a dollar that you don't mind parting with, it could make a genuinely significant difference for me. But let me just stress, I don't want any money that you need for yourself. Take care of yourself first. I'm just happy that you're watching. Anyway, if you know a One Piece fan who might like these shorts, why not send them this compilation? Word of mouth helps a lot too. Alright, self-promotion over, back to the shorts. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 42 is very much an interstitial chapter. Its function in the story is to give the Straw Hats a new destination, a quest to pursue, which it does by having them run into these two random weirdos in the middle of the ocean. I don't know if Johnny and Yosaku were meant to matter more to the story, but as designs, they are a bit naffed, frankly. Consequently, there aren't really any standout panels to gush about here. I love Usopp's face as he squishes his nose against the window here. That's just good expression work. And for the action shots, well, we've got Luffy throwing Johnny into the wall here. That's dynamic, if a little bit unclear in the action. And we got this shot of Luffy landing behind him that has some really great use of curved ground and perspective. It's way more than the panel really needs, but it does look good. But probably the best panel is this one. Luffy and Usopp pouring lime juice down Yosaku's throat in the foreground with comic inelegance, while Nami explains the concept of scurvy in the background. It's nothing exceptional, but the expressions and the poses that the guys are making, well, they do make me smile every time I see them. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 43 establishes our new arc on the floating Baratie restaurant, and it's mostly concerned with introducing the players and the stakes that will drive the conflict. So we get to meet minor villain Lieutenant Fullbody, whose function is mostly to be unlikable and arrogant so Sanji can kick his ass, and Chef Zeph with his unreasonable demands and extremely conspicuous peg leg, which Luffy explicitly calls attention to make sure you don't miss it. I wonder if it'll be important later. I do love the panel where Luffy accidentally blasts the Baratie with a cannonball, and we see the crew lit up in stark black and white, and even the Merry itself is startled by what happened. That's cute, but yeah, no, of course the best panel goes to Sanji's introduction, specifically because he's introduced with one hand casually in his pocket and carrying a plate on his head instead. It's a small thing, but it's instantly quite endearing. With the Straw Hats, Sanji is a more lighthearted counterpart to Zoro's seriousness, and this panel does go some ways towards establishing that tone for him. Sanji is a bit more cavalier, a little bit more casual, a little louder in the personality. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 44 continues the opening act of this arc, introducing us to more of the culinary weirdos of the Baratie like Patty, and playing up the enormous contrast between the glamorous restaurant environment and the wild personalities that run it. And this is all in the service of something. Patty is shown as ruthlessly business-minded, casually beating Jin when he demands food without payment, and Zeph is shown as a stubborn old goat of a man unwilling to bend on any of his demands. But then there's Sanji, who comes to Jin when he's been kicked out and gives the starving man the food he so desperately needs, and gives us the best panel of the chapter. It's not a technical masterpiece, but what makes it good is the gesture. Sanji sits down with Jin casually, smoking his cigarette, and conspicuously doesn't stare at him or keep an eye on him. He doesn't tower over him or look down on him or treat him with any suspicion. He just feeds a man who's hungry. When Luffy says, "I have found my cook," this is why. Not his combat skill or even his culinary abilities, but his kindness, and we see that demonstrated visually right here. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 45 is an exposition chapter. The idea here is to establish Don Krieg as a scary villain whom our heroes will soon have to fight and play up the overwhelming menace of the Grand Line and heighten the danger of the party's overarching quest. You might remember that in the Syrup Village arc, I thought the exposition was kinda ham-fisted, with characters just telling each other things they both already know at really awkward times. This arc does a much better job mixing the exposition with world building and storytelling. It happens as background while Luffy is bickering with Sanji over recruiting him to sail on the Mary, and it happens while the chefs of the Baratie prepare food and bicker with each other, helping to establish a sense of their camaraderie and culture so that we are invested in, so we see the Baratie as something that deserves to be protected when it is inevitably threatened. This panel is my favorite. There's such a great sense of practiced casual movement in Patty and Karn while they talk and cook. That huge flame of the flambe barely causes either of them to react, and the vegetables flying apart while Karn is barely concentrating on the cutting makes the storytelling flow and feel natural, like something that's just happening between these two characters over the course of their normal lives. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 46 sets the main conflict of the arc off, with Don Krieg finally arriving to declare war on the Baratie to steal the ship. It also introduces us to Sanji's uncontrollable womanizing, which, well, it's not his best trait, but at least he's not fucking Mineta about it. There's some great storytelling here. This panel, recounting Don Krieg's crimes, is great, using those white silhouettes to depict atrocity without actually depicting it. Thematically, it's also just important and meaningful that Sanji shows the same kindness to Krieg that he does to Jin, and Krieg's betrayal of that kindness marks him out as a weak man in contrast to our heroes. The best panel, though, is this one. The flagship of the Don Krieg Armada, battered and crushed from the Grand Line, looming into view like a mountain towering over the comparatively tiny Baratie ship. Yeah, it world builds for the menace of the Grand Line, again, but more importantly, it establishes the threat of Don Krieg and his men, the overwhelming odds that our heroes are up against. And it does this very effectively, simply by showing a difference in physical scale. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 47, Don Krieg demands food for his men so he can take over the Baratie, much to the horror of the chefs who live there. And it has some great action panels to go along with this conflict. Patty firing his cannon and Krieg taking the hit are both good dynamic compositions, and so is Krieg's counterattack on the chefs. But you know me, I'm not so easily swayed by a sleek action panel. I want character and storytelling. Sanji agrees to cook the food for Don Krieg, loudly declaring that his job as a chef is not to judge even the lowliest scum of the earth. If someone is hungry, his calling is to feed them. And when the other chefs disagree, he casually tells them that they will have to kill him to stop him. In One Piece, kindness and the courage of your convictions is strength, it's willpower, it's what makes a hero. And so for me, Sanji staring down the other chefs framed at the center of those concentric circles in the ceiling, ready to die for what he believes in, no matter what the circumstances, that is a hero moment. This is how you establish capital C character. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 48 establishes Luffy's conflict with Don Krieg, which is that Don Krieg says that he's going to find the One Piece and Luffy says that he's going to find the One Piece, and so obviously they have to have a fight about that, which, yeah, Don Krieg isn't exactly the most compelling villain in the series. What's far more interesting is the foreshadowing and the world building going on in the B-plot, specifically the story of how Don Krieg's 50-ship armada was lost. It's being told by Gin, of course, whose physical acting keeps him looking weak, limp, and feeble, something which is going to pay off later. But the flashback gives us by far our most compelling comic panel, like this one, which is organized around a fisheye swirl that makes the world seem like it's literally been turned upside down on the Grand Line, communicating Gin's confusion perfectly. The best panel, though, is this one, the first foreshadowing of Mihawk, if only because of that stark and heavy-shadowed rendering that makes Mihawk's shadow look like it's literally haunting Gin's thoughts. It gives a real ghost story vibe, like he's some kind of horrifying cryptid of the seas. It's an excellent way to build up his menace. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 49 sees the arrival of Mihawk to completely undercut Don Krieg as the villain of this arc, although that's not really that hard to do. Don Krieg sucks. And so it's tempting to see the splash page as the best panel of the chapter. This huge moment, a demonstration of Mihawk's power and a technical tour de force as a drawing to boot. As ship is a difficult object to render even in a cartoony art style, and Oda and his team here knock it the hell out of the park. The sense of scale is absolutely astonishing. But I also think the action is a little unclear, the page is a little bit too crowded, and there are technical nitpicks. And so I gravitate to this panel instead. Don Krieg's men desperately eating their food because while it's not nearly as technically impressive, the acting and the composition is so very much on point here. You feel the desperation and chaos of these men absolutely shoving food and water into their heads, the tension and desperation of the moment for them, the starvation that they've been through. It's a very difficult kind of scene to compose and pull off with this level of acute visual clarity. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 50 is yet another chapter that completely ignores Don Krieg in favor of much more interesting action and gives us a full introduction for Mihawk, who does steal a bunch of scenes here by sheer force of character design. His flowery coat sleeves, the giant crucifix-like sword, the ultra-intense eyes, and peculiar facial hair, he's just a tremendously interesting character to look at. I especially love the little head tilt he does when one of Krieg's men asks him why he's even hunting them in the first place. That little moment he takes to think before he just says, "for fun." It's a hell of a character introduction. But you know me, I'm a sucker for character acting, and in this chapter, Nami takes the cake for me. As she looks off to the side, telling Johnny and Yosaku that she's running off, her expression has such a sense of exhaustion and resignation. You get a little peek behind her facade there, with that hand running through her hair and that tired expression on her face. She just gives you that little moment of accidental vulnerability that's so compelling when it comes to a character who's otherwise duplicitous. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 51 is the first fight between Zoro and Mihawk, and Zoro's first big defeat, and oh god, I have to pick one best panel from this? This fight is bangers from start to finish, but okay, let's talk about why it's bangers. A great fight, a really great fight in a story, is always a conversation between the combatants. It's not just swords and fists flying, it's the characters themselves being tested against each other, and my god, this fight is a great example of that. Mihawk starts the fight arms crossed, bored expression, utterly disengaged and uninterested in Zoro. But every time Zoro demonstrates his spirit, his resolve, and his will, Mihawk becomes more and more interesting, more and more engaged, and starts to wonder and be curious about this young swordsman. And this evolution culminates in him drawing his true sword to deliver the killing blow, and when Zoro offers his front, he gives him his very first smile. Mihawk has been impressed, and so the final sword strike, the best panel in the chapter, is also the beginning of the rivalry friendship between them. It rules so hard, and a better fight is told in this one chapter than in the 15 more it's gonna take to finish off Don Krieg. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 52 is the denouement of Zoro and Mihawk's duel, with Don Krieg making a rather pathetic attempt at reasserting himself as a villain that anyone actually cares about. And there's two panels here that I want to highlight. The first is at the opening of the chapter, this shot of Mihawk holding his blade right after the big swing, because god damn, that is a great action shot. The curving swoop of his coat flushes with the curve of the sword, and it's contrasted with that arc of blood that is drawn in the air from Zoro's chest. Like, ooh, it's just such a goddamn good dynamic shot. You really feel the weight of this moment. The second panel, though, it's much less visually impressive, but honestly it's much more impactful from a storytelling standpoint, and it's just about the perfect character action for Zoro. How does he tell Luffy that he's still alive? How does he make his vow to never lose again? With a single blade pointed to the heavens, held proud in a steady arm, despite his horrible injuries. And that is peak Zoro, right there. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 53 forces us back to the conflict with Don Krieg, who does his level best to be interesting, and though he fails, we do get a greater sense of why he was such a failure on the Grand Line. For all his violent bravado, Krieg is someone who's simply incapable of learning a lesson. He blames all of his failures on everything other than himself. "I just didn't know enough, that's why I lost. Mihawk must have had a devil fruit, that's why I lost." This is his weakness as a person and as a captain, and it's the reason he is going to lose to Luffy, who will never blame his failures on anything other than himself. It's hard to say, though, that there's any particularly impactful panels in this chapter. Luffy's Gum Scythe is nice, I guess, and the mackerel head gags are funny, but honestly, if there's a best one, it's probably this panel, if for no other reason than it's a gorgeous technical drawing, and it does do a really good job of establishing the geography of the fight, which is important for what's going to happen later. Even if it's not exciting to look at on its own, good setup is important for a good comic. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 54 introduces us to Pearl, who could generously be described as a complete fucking filler character and a waste of everyone's time. But, okay, I'll try not to complain about him the whole time. Mostly, this chapter is about establishing Sanji as a heavy hitter and establishing his abilities, so he spends a bunch of time doing his fancy kicks, and I do love this sequence of faces just getting stepped on by him. It's wonderfully goofy. And a thing I do like about early One Piece is that Sanji is often drawn essentially like a rubber hose character when he's fighting, using his solid black suit to mask his actual anatomy, and it allows him to get away with some truly noodle-limbed bullshit, and it looks great in practice. The best panel and the best example is this one. If you spend any time actually analyzing the pose, it looks like absolute bloody nonsense, but because the gesture, movement, and reaction of the victim is on point, it reads as a bone-crunchingly powerful spinning kick. It's great stuff, and it makes Sanji feel really strong, despite his skinny and slender character design. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 55 is more Pearl, which, honestly, who cares? Pearl is only really there to help establish Sanji as unafraid and powerful, and he doesn't even really manage that because he gets taken out by other people twice. Zeph gets a little cool moment, though, kicking out the flames on some of Pearl's pearls, and I do love that Oda gave him such a stupidly tall chef's hat that even the extreme perspective of that panel can't actually fit it in there. It's a fun design detail, and it sort of hints at how much childish pride the guy has underneath his tough exterior. As for a best panel, though, I think it's this one of Luffy and Sanji dodging Pearl's flames. The posing is dynamic as hell. It just looks great with the characters all in motion, but it's a great composition, too. The image is divided between the three characters, Luffy in the foreground, Sanji in the middle ground, and Pearl at the back, and you see how Oda uses Luffy's limbs and that plume of flame to break the panel up? Sanji has his own little frame within the frame, and Pearl has one too, and that's a really solid, readable composition for an image like this. It's just good comic craft. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 56 gives us a break in the action, with Gin taking Zeph hostage and Sanji having to suffer a beatdown from Pearl because he refuses to surrender the restaurant because it is too important to Zeph. As other characters wonder why Sanji would put his life on the line for the chef he talks so much, Oda uses the opportunity to fade into one of his trademark flashbacks. And I do want to call out the fade frame here because there's a nice consonance between Sanji's black suit and the rising black screen tone that denotes a flashback, and that really does create the feeling of following Sanji's thoughts as they slip unbidden into a memory. But the best panel is a quieter little thing. Sanji's being teased about the all blue by the other chefs in his first kitchen, and we get this panel. And I just love this gesture. I love the way that this guy's leaning over and smirking at the same time. It has so much character. It makes the dialogue feel very real and gives you a real sense of the relationship between these characters, that Sanji is like a kid talking to his uncles who tease him but also try to encourage him. It's not an important panel by any means, but to me the acting here just sings. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 57 gives us sweet relief from the fight with Pearl, taking place instead in the much more interesting story of how Sanji met Zeph for the first time, and it is focused on Zeph, a character whose words constantly contradict his actions. He arrives on the ship as a brutal pillager, stealing everything of value, but then brutally disciplines his own man for stealing food. He tells the crew to kill Sanji for resisting, but the moment Sanji is swept overboard, he risks his life to save him without hesitation. When they wash up on a barren rock, he tells Sanji that he can only have a tiny amount of food, but then he cuts off his own leg to eat it? It's character built through action. It's lightning fast, but within only a few pages, we kind of understand who Zeph is and begin to understand why Sanji cares about him. And the best panel is this one, Zeph with his foot on Sanji's head, because here he is at once pushing him away and comforting him. He's telling him the plan and explaining how the two of them might survive, giving Sanji hope, even while he insists on pretending like he cares nothing for this eggplant-headed brat he just happened to save. Which are the best panels in One Piece? One Piece is one of those stories that if you're into it, if you emotionally invest in it, it will break your heart 100 times. There's a handful of moments in the story that will move me to tears almost every time I see them, and one of them is in Chapter 58. The chapter opens with hope. Sanji has a bit of food, he has rainwater to drink, he has split his rations, and he thinks that a ship is surely going to come soon. And from there, the chapter takes us through deprivation. The food stores dwindle, he drinks water to silence his stomach, he sits lonely on the naked rock, and he stares at the empty ocean. His last piece of bread turns to mold, the stores run out, and he begins to shrink and shrivel, his body eating itself from the hunger. It gets to be too much and he stalks up to Zeph, assuming that the old man has food stored away in his sack, and then he cuts it open and nothing but worthless gold spills out. Zeph gave Sanji the food, all of it, every bit, and he ate his own leg instead. When Sanji, horrified, demands of him why he would do this for a brat who showed him nothing but contempt, Zeph just stares straight at the horizon and simply says, "Because you had the same dream as me." And this is where I choke up sometimes because, well, the chapter first of all explains why Sanji fed Gin, because he's been here, and it explains why Gin becomes so moved by that compassion that he cannot hurt Sanji in turn, because Gin has been here too. But most importantly, it explains how Sanji and Zeph can shout and bicker and insult each other with the brutality of enemies, but they are bound by bonds of unbreakable love because they have both been here. But beyond that, pay attention to Zeph as the conversation goes on. At first, his face is impassive and neutral, but see, as Sanji begins to shout at him, how the tension appears, the popping veins characteristic of emotions that are being held in check. "You ate your own foot?" "That's right." "You gave all the food to me?" "Yes." "Why would you be so kind?" And with sweat pouring off of his brow and veins popping all over his face, for the very first time, Zeph speaks honestly. because you had the same dream as me. All the chefs and pirates we've seen so far laugh at the idea of the All Blue. It's an embarrassing thing to believe in, but Zeph believes, and now he's found someone else who believes in it too. It's after this moment that Zeph starts opening up emotionally. He tells Sanji about his dreams, his ambitions to build a floating restaurant, and he tells the kid to chase the All Blue in his place. He opens up and you can see that it's a relief to him. You can see how it softens him. He lays back in exhaustion, and for the first time, he gets to show vulnerability. You had the same dream as me. And that is more precious than gold to a pirate, more precious than food to a starving man. You had the same dream as me. That's One Piece. The best panel of One Piece Chapter 59 is this one, because it's when Pearl finally gets owned and we don't have to fucking see him anymore. Or, well, it's actually kind of a shoddy panel when I look at it. Pearl's shield fracturing is gorgeously rendered, but Gin's action pose is kind of weak and doesn't really sell the foreshortening and dynamism that it's going for. I do like the character design trickery of this moment, though. Gin, with his skinny, lanky frame and fairly pedestrian clothing, is designed to come across as just some henchman, like compare and contrast with how weird Pearl looks. But the reveal, of course, is that he is Krieg's most powerful battle commander, and that's a fun idea if only Krieg was an interesting enough villain to really deserve it. So the actual best panel is this one, a brief flash in between two other panels of Shanks with his missing arm in the water. And its positioning is actually important here. Luffy is staring down Sanji, telling him not to throw his life away, and we see that Shanks is literally coloring Luffy's vision. He sees Sanji's situation literally through his experience with Shanks. It's one very quick panel that instantly puts us inside Luffy's head and makes us understand what he means by what he says, and that is very good comic craft. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 60 sees us returning to the fight with Don Krieg, who is nonetheless never actually going to be a main character in any of the action. The real drama is between Luffy, Sanji, and Gin. Krieg's major trait as a villain is his profound insecurity. He cannot bear to take responsibility for, well, pretty much anything, and that manifests in his constant making excuses about why he couldn't hack it on the Grand Line, but also in the way that he fetishizes his stuff. My spear is the mightiest, my poison gas is the deadliest, my armor is the sturdiest. Just like Pearl, he's someone who always needs something to hide behind. His 50 ships, his 5,000 men, his special equipment. And partly because of that, I think that the best panel of the chapter is this one. Don Krieg rhetorically asks, who of us is most suited to be Pirate King? And Luffy simply answers, me. And here, the character design is doing work. Krieg, with his cape and his complex shaded armor and his complicated weapons and his big bold posturing, is being utterly undercut by this cartoon monkey boy with a silly hat who is not impressed and who will never be scared of him. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 61 is a fight chapter, so it's lots and lots of action shots following the duels between Gin and Sanji and Luffy and Don Krieg, and it slows the storytelling down a lot. On purpose, of course. Shonen fights take their time, and that's a strength of the genre. We get to see the difference between Krieg's gadget tactics and Luffy's single-minded determination, highlighting how different they both are, but Sanji and Gin are interestingly quite similar. They're both technical fighters with high power, dueling on nearly equal footing, if not for Sanji's injuries, with fancy move countering fancy move. And I think that similarity contributes to the feeling of tragedy between them, that these are two men who would have easily been friends in other circumstances, to which end the best panel is of course Gin's tearful breakdown, his realization that his debt to Sanji's kindness and his heart compel him to mercy more than Don Krieg can order him to violence. And the posing here is great. That tense hand pulling his bandana over his eyes shows visually the shame he feels at this realization, and his expression is full of anger mixed with grief because he knows how this has to end. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 62 gives us a big dramatic crescendo as Don Krieg finally deploys his Chekhov's gun, the MH5 poison gas. Narratively, this is Krieg repeating Kuro's weakness, failing to value his crew as anything other than things. Gin, for the mere act of asking a favor, is condemned to death, and the way that Gin himself rationalizes and accepts his punishment makes it even more tragic. He names himself a weak-minded traitor rather than resisting Don Krieg, and it's not the first time or the last that a One Piece villain has an emotionally abusive dynamic with their underlings. It all heightens the drama when Gin forces a gas mask onto Sanji's face by holding him down and nearly smothering him in the best panel. He's been so thoroughly broken by his years with Don Krieg that he cannot value his life at all, but he does value Sanji and extends to him all of the compassion he cannot extend to himself. So of course the visual language of his sacrifice is violence. He forces his mercy on Sanji because Gin, the demon, lives in a world that permits no other form of kindness. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 63 is more Don Krieg fight, which, okay, I guess we have to get through it. The fight is boring to me because unlike Crocodile and Doflamingo later on, Krieg simply hasn't earned so extensive of a showdown. His narrative role relative to our protagonists is not to be a genuine challenge, but to be a demonstration of what makes Luffy as great of a captain as he is. That is fully accomplished arguably already, but definitely by the end of the chapter, and so the rest of the fight is just a bunch of action that doesn't really do much or tell us anything new about the characters. But the chapter does have one good bit of characterization. Luffy is now pissed off enough to make it personal, and so he charges right through Krieg's volley of attacks to strike at him directly. Krieg protects himself with a perfect counter to a punch, an armored spike cape, and Luffy would literally have to hurt himself to hit him, which no one would ever be stupid enough to... Oh, Luffy's greatest strength is his freedom, particularly his freedom from fear, and this is why he will be Pirate King. Which are the best panels of One Piece? As we've already talked about, the fight with Don Krieg is basically already over. Luffy has won, and all the narrative meaning of his victory over Krieg has already been delivered, but One Piece is not always a perfectly paced story, and so the fight has to go on. But hey, it's not all bad. It's a cool fight with some hype moments and some great art, even if it is a little bit perfunctory. Krieg's big swings with the spear are almost universally really well-composed action shots, especially the big swing here. The twist and power in the pose is really dynamic and cool looking. Krieg's face when he realizes Luffy is clinging to his spear is great too. It really shows that Luffy is getting to him, and given that Krieg was boasting not 2 chapters ago about how nothing is so easy to kill as an enraged foe, it's a nice little storytelling moment for his weakness of character and his hypocrisy. But the best panel is this one, just because it's a genuinely really funny moment. The way that Luffy just clings onto the spear like, whoo, that's a good little comedy relief moment, and I really love his expression here. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 65 is yet more Don Krieg fight, which, and once again, my solace as a reader has to be simply turning my brain off and enjoying the action for what it is. This chapter has Zeph make a wise and experienced point about how it's not the strength of the weapons that makes someone a dangerous fighter, but their strength of spirit, which, again, is a point that has already kind of been made by the action, but hey, thanks for the reminder, I guess. The action remains at the high level of quality that One Piece generally has. I especially like Krieg casually swatting aside the falling ship's mast here, and of course, Luffy shattering his armor is a hype moment as well, absolutely gorgeously rendered by Oda, like all the best villain impact panels are. But for my money, the best panel is still this, a moment of comedy likeness where Luffy is swinging on a mast while making monkey noises specifically to mock Don Krieg by once again refusing to take him seriously. Beyond being just good fun, it is also an important part of the tone of One Piece, and one of the things I enjoy most about the series. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 66 begins with yet more Don Krieg fight, because despite the giant impact panel in the last chapter, we still have to have another one as Krieg launches one last rather pointless attempt to take Luffy down with him. The Gum Gum Gavel is a gorgeously rendered panel, but the fight hype is really losing its steam at this point. Much better is the aftermath of Krieg's final defeat, where he rants and raves about how this doesn't count as a real defeat, I'm the strongest man on the seas, and he's unable as ever to assume the actual responsibility of a captain. Gin gut punches him for that, telling him to take it like a man, because like so many characters will be, Gin has been set free from his fears by Luffy, including his fear of Don Krieg. And so the best panel is this one, where Gin and Sanji part ways, each of them side by side with the troublesome idiots that they call their captains. Again, their similarity is emphasized in the comic, and there's a good character design trick here, with Gin shedding the headband and his jacket, suddenly looking much cooler, much more confident, and much less like he's anyone's henchman. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 67 begins the denouement of the Don Krieg fight, wrapping up the dramatic stakes and finally working on getting Sanji to let go of the Baratie. But because the people who work there are all a bunch of f***ing line cooks and chefs, the only way they know how to do that is to shout abuse at one another. I really love the way they handle this so poorly. It's so clear that nobody here has any goddamn idea how to broach an emotionally difficult subject or be honest about their feelings, and so they put on a whole-ass idiot stage play trying to get Sanji to leave on his own. The best panel, though, is the punch, specifically because if you've been paying attention, the fact that Zeph punches him rather than kicks him is off. It's a really out-of-character thing for him to do. As Sanji has said, chefs do not do violence with their hands, so this shows us visually that Zeph is really desperate for this to work, for Sanji to chase his dream on the Grand Line to the point that he's willing to risk the safety of his hands to do it. It's a good bit of subtle acting from the character, undercut by the story immediately calling attention to it multiple times just in case you didn't get it, but it is a shonen and it has to be accessible for kids, so maybe that's okay, really. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 68 is the final wrap-up for the Baratie and the setup for the next arc, so Yosaku shows up in a ridiculous comedy fashion to tell Luffy to proceed to next location. Sanji, having realized the other chefs went so far as to lie to him to make him chase his dreams, finally gives in and comes along, and so we get long pensive scenes of both Sanji and Zeph reflecting on their history, the Baratie, what it took to make it what it is, and how much their time together has meant to them, and it's all built up to a wonderful payoff. All the chefs continue their sniping and shouting insults at one another, incapable of handling the difficult emotions of a farewell, until who else but Chef Zev with the golden heart slips up and gives Sanji that single bit of kindness. Keep your feet dry. And everything now finally breaks. Everyone starts weeping and crying and pouring their goddamn hearts out, and even old stone-faced Zeph can't resist it. His is therefore the best panel, because this expression, you can see it, right? The pride, the love, and the sadness, that complex pain of a father seeing his son grow up into a man. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 69, nice, is a big exposition chapter with Oda planting several seeds like Jinbei and the Fishman Island that don't pay off until literally over a decade later, but it's also a big exposition dump and not that interesting visually. Much more interesting are Nami's panels and her confrontation with the child who's come to kill Arlong. Nami is a character who we've seen repeatedly act out of compassion and selflessness, putting her own body in harm's way to protect others with no expectation of a direct reward, so the assault, the best panel of the chapter, is shocking. I mean, she's beating a child, it's meant to be shocking, but it's utterly contrary to everything we know her to be. And so I note that Oda hides her face during this beating. He hides her expression, her emotions from us, deliberately turning the camera away from her. Even in this big dynamic attack, her arm is conspicuously covering her up. Nami is hiding her true face, literally and figuratively, acting wildly out of character, not only by assaulting the kid, but also by giving him money, the thing that she's been most wildly obsessed with collecting. As a hook for the next story arc, these panels are killer. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 70 is the proper beginning of an adventure, with Usopp and Johnny getting into idiot coward shenanigans on the Konomi Islands, dodging fishmen, getting Zoro captured, and Usopp even demonstrating a little bit of his real bravery before getting KO'd by Nojiko. And I really do love Nojiko's scene with the kid here. It touches on some of One Piece's most important themes, which are love of life and the importance of carrying on for those who came before us, and taking care of those who are still with us rather than surrendering to the impulse for revenge and retaliation. You wouldn't know it at this stage, but this scene is really a thesis statement for the whole series. But no, the best panel is this. Usopp and Johnny seeing the village turned upside down. It's such striking imagery. These houses literally turned on their heads is somehow a more terrifying idea than if they had been merely destroyed. And it's also purposeful. You can see just by looking at this that someone was making a point here, a threat. This is a kind of rhetoric, propaganda for Arlong's brutal rule, and it's just a great drawing, using a much more naturalistic rendering for the scene and grounded anatomy for the otherwise cartoony Usopp to make the gravity of the moment sink in. It's just good craft. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 71 has some genuinely excellent drama as it continues to explore Nami's character, with her stepsister both refusing to give the game away that she knows what Nami is doing, but also clearly being happy to see that her sister has found friends on her adventures. And we get to see why Nami was hiding her face when she beat the child, because she has a terrible poker face, which Zoro sees through immediately. And it's a nice moment for him, too, to demonstrate his sharp sense of empathy, because he immediately forces her to show her hand by trying to drown himself, and realizes that the Nami he knows is the real person, and that the officer of the Arlong pirates is her disguise. And the best panel of the chapter is really just an expression here, as Nami tries to hold the mask after dealing with Zoro and realizes, oh shit, that idiot Usopp is here too. And you get that in her expression here, right? That mix of anger that her friends followed her, fear for what might happen to them, and her mind racing to find a way to save them. It is grim-faced, stressful tension from a woman who only knows how to take on the burdens of everyone else's well-being. And that is not an easy thing to draw on an anime girl's face. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 72 escalates the tension of the arc, with Arlong demonstrating just how brutal he's willing to be to maintain his reign. Usopp gets some great comedy moments, once again demonstrating his remarkable bravery by saving Genzo and the entire Koko village from being annihilated, simply by annoying Arlong so much that he completely forgets what he was doing. Nami once again gets some lovely acting to do. Her expression here as the Koko villagers slam their doors in her face is an excellent mix of resignation and sorrow, and it contrasts great with the panel right before it, where she's putting on an unaffected front. Oda plays a lot visually with the idea of Nami being two-faced and elevates her characterization a lot, I think. The best panel, though, I have to give it to Zoro lounging on Arlong's throne/pool chair with the corpses of dispatched fishmen surrounding him. Narratively, it decimates all of Arlong's rhetoric about being inherently superior to humans, because even wounded by Mihawk, Zoro is stronger than a dozen fishmen underlings, and visually, I just think he looks so f***ing cool here. He's rocking that patterned shirt. Oda's fashion game doesn't get talked up as much as other shonen artists, but damn, even in bandages, my boy makes this fit look good. Where can I buy that shirt? Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 73 starts moving the pieces for the Straw Hats' confrontation with Arlong, drawing Luffy and Sanji towards the islands while sending Zoro off to Koko Village to save Usopp, who in turn has already arrived at Arlong Park, captured by the fishmen. There's nothing Oda loves quite so much as contriving silly reasons for the Straw Hats to get split up before a big fight. It's also a chapter that, in the wake of reminding us all how strong Zoro is, takes the time to remind us how overpowered Sanji is by having him absolutely take poor Mumu out. Notably, he does it with an anatomical precision strike rather than Luffy's simple blunt force, and that's a nice little bit of storytelling about their fighting styles. The best panel of the chapter, though, I think, is this one, where Arlong discovers what Zoro has done to his crew, specifically because it's the only moment of genuine tenderness we see him show. True despair about how his people have been hurt, cradling one of them in his arms while on his knees. It implies that there might be some emotional depth to Arlong beyond his brutality, and we will get to see that pay off in like a decade, but it also highlights that the cruelty he shows to humans is a decision that he's choosing to make for a reason we don't understand, and not the result of an inborn evil nature. Which are the best panels of One Piece? For Chapter 74, I'm going to cut to the chase and say that it is the stab. Of course it's the stab, happening in the middle of Usopp's smoke bomb with the perspective pulled back just enough so that we can't quite see the knife going into Usopp's stomach. It's a great bit of framing and great sleight of hand, because even though we know for a fact that Nami is of course only acting, if you're a kid reading this, well, maybe there's a little room for doubt in your mind at this point. That is a lot of blood. This chapter also has more good acting from Nami, which I'm always weak for. The cold, disaffected expressions that she uses with the Arlong crew are contrasted with the intense and stressed out expressions she has when she's in close with Usopp. The bright light in her normally solid black eyes walks the line between looking demonic and evil, but also reflects the intensity of the anxiety and the trust that she's putting in Usopp to know what she wants him to do here. I also have a lot of fondness for her face here, right before she attacks Usopp. Again, because it's that mix of anger, resignation, stress, and fear that she knows she's about to have to take an enormous risk if she wants to save him, but she would never be able to live with herself if she didn't. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 75 finally gets Luffy, Sanji, and Zoro all together for the big fight, but of course they land on the wrong side of the island, which allows the story some time to set up the last important pieces of Nami's backstory so the conclusion will land with the appropriate heft. Consequently, this is kind of a filler chapter in its structure. Some Marines arrive and shoot at Arlong, and they're easily dispatched by the fishmen, and it's meant to establish the threat and power levels for the upcoming fight, that Zoro may have easily taken out the goons, but Arlong's officers, they're a different breed of powerful, which, okay, sure, but it's just not that exciting to watch them beat up a bunch of total nobodies. Like, even Oda doesn't take this seriously, judging by the patently ridiculous joke design he gave to the Marine Commodore. The best panel, then, is probably this. Zoro, caught moments before disaster, as Luffy begins his running gag of constantly accidentally injuring his poor first mate with his silly comedy antics. It's a great panel on the technical merits alone. It's using a deep field of view and a fisheye lens effect to really sell the scale of the oncoming impact, and Luffy's idiot cheering there over the railing to sell the comedy makes for a really fun panel to look at. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 76 gets Luffy and Nami some time face-to-face, and it goes, well, about like you'd expect. Nami comes at Luffy with all of her complex two-faced anger, despair, and desperation to get them the hell out of danger, and Luffy, just like he did to Don Krieg, refuses to take it seriously. For all that he's a dumbass, Luffy always knows when someone is speaking from their heart, and he knows that Nami's heart isn't in this. It's a trait, by the way, that Oda later develops into the concept of hearing the voice of all things, but for now, it's probably not that deep yet. The best panel, though, is this one, where Nojiko comes home to find Nami has smashed up the house. Because number one, it tells us that she's close to her breaking point, nearly boiling over with frustration, anger, and fear for the fates of her annoying beloved friends. But also, it tells us that this is the only place in the world where Nami feels safe to let her feelings out. Everywhere else in this story, we see her bottle them up, hide them away, mask them. This house is the only place in the world where she feels safe to be honest. And that is some well-observed visual storytelling, I think. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Man, Belmere is so fucking cool. Like, she's just such a cool character. I really want to know more about her and what her life was like, because from the moment she shows up, she just looks interesting. Her character design is great. She's young, she smokes, she has that buzzed hair with the disconnected locks that makes her look almost punk-like. Anime moms, especially dead anime moms, have a tendency to be angelic and idealized in their femininity. These gentle, nurturing domestic spirits tenderly caring for their young in such a way that their deaths come across as maximally tragic. But Belmere, I mean, again, she looks like a punk. If anything, she looks like their elder sister rather than their mother. And you see immediately where Nami gets it from when she uses a combination of sexual forwardness and scam artist charm to get Nami out of trouble with Genzo. The fun doesn't last, though, because this is a flashback and Oda wants to hurt us, showing us the desperate circumstances under which Belmere adopted her daughters and the scale of their poverty. And I think the best panel is this one. Belmere clutching her children in her arms, carrying them through the heart of a storm, because that's what mothers do. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Well, in Chapter 78, it's Belle-Mère with the gun in Arlong's mouth. She's so f***ing cool. It's a great dynamic composition and a fantastic moment of badassery. I say that this is the best panel because if I try to talk about the actual best panel, I might choke up a little bit, because that panel has a wounded and bloodied Belle-Mère clutching her children because she would rather die than ever say out loud that she does not have daughters. She's apologizing that she couldn't be a good enough mother to them, and goddamn you, Eiichiro Oda, you can't do this to me in the silly pirate comic about the funny stretchy man. The last thing Belle-Mère says to her children, with a smile and a little love heart in the speech bubble, is, "I love you." And oh my god, Oda, give me a second to recover here. But do pay attention to this moment, because it will not be the last time that a character dies apologizing that they couldn't do better and wishing nothing except that the people they leave behind know that they are loved. Anyway, if you'll excuse me, I think I need a tissue. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 79, Oda is just continuing the 38-hit emotional punishment combo he's been on already, playing out the aftermath of Belle-Mère's death with the memories of her promise that better times will come, even while Arlong's crew brutalize the village and steal away Nami to use her for her navigational skills. It's bleak. Basically, it's just a non-stop cavalcade of all the worst things you could possibly imagine as the villagers discuss how impossible their situation is and decide to rise up and fight. And then Nami returns and tells them that she's joined Arlong's pirates in an absolutely desperate gamble to buy the freedom of the village all on her own at the age of 10, even if it means inviting the hatred and rejection of every person that she's fighting for. Jesus. The best panels, though, is, well, there's two of them, actually. These ones, of Nami shaking her head in denial when Genso tries to question her about what she's doing, because she's overacting and being defiant in exactly the way that a stubborn 10-year-old child would be. Oda gets this physical acting painfully correct. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 80 is very much about reminding you that the Navy is a hive of scum and that all Marines are bastards. Yes, including whichever one of the nice ones that you're thinking of right now, because they're all complicit in a system of abuse and corruption. Captain Nezuko isn't a particularly prominent villain, but I've always found him memorable due to the sheer unbearableness of his smug, gleeful abuse of cruelty. His character design, with that horrible soul patch, thin brows, and sharply drawn eyes, is constantly hatched with shadows that give his face an uncanny volume whenever he's enjoying being a piece of shit on purpose. It makes him inhuman looking, aided by the whiskers on his lip, and it makes for a good villain design. And the best panel, hatefully, belongs to him too, because it's this one, where he's casually walking away while ordering his Marines to fire lethal rounds at civilians because they're inconveniencing his search for a payday. And it's the gesture that does it, the raised hand on the head turned away and inclined downwards, almost as though he's just waving away an annoying fly. The absolute lack of interest in the people he's brutalizing is infuriating. Nezuko is a portrait of evil in One Piece, a preview of everything the Celestial Dragons will eventually stand for. Which are the best panels in One Piece? It's often said in the One Piece community that you should stick with it until Arlong Park, and if you're not into One Piece by that point, that's when you know it's not a series for you. I think that's true, and the reason why is this scene. This scene is how you know. Nami has spent 80 years working on her own since she was a child of only 10, lying, deceiving, stealing, fighting, and scamming, all to gather the money that Arlong wants so she can save her village. And now with a goal in sight, Arlong uses the Navy, all Marines are bastards, to steal her money so he can keep exploiting her. The villagers she's been protecting have had enough and are going to throw themselves at the fishmen and die, and the beloved friends that she made on the Straw Hat crew keep refusing to leave even though she knows that Arlong will kill them. Her every ray of hope and all of her attempts at keeping control and saving everyone have failed, and now, reduced to incoherent rage and sorrow, she sits in the dirt, stabbing a dagger into the tattoo on her shoulder because hurting herself is the only thing she can do to spite Arlong. And then Luffy comes along and stops her. She yells at him, throws dirt at him, rejects him, tells him to f*** off, basically. And when he doesn't, because she has nothing else left, because there's no plan, because everything is falling down around her, she finally lets down her walls and says what's in her heart. Luffy, help me. And Luffy takes off his hat, his treasure, and gives it to her, and walks forward, and with his characteristic cartoony ridiculousness, screams as loud as he possibly can, "Of course I will!" Luffy doesn't know why she needs him. He doesn't know why she lied, why she stole the ship. He doesn't know about Belle-Mère or Nojiko or Nami's deal with Arlong. And he doesn't need to know. Because she's his friend, and she's his crew, and he loves her, she doesn't need a tragic backstory to deserve his help. She deserves it because she needs it. She deserves it because she asked. Luffy knows that every time Nami tried to push him away, every time she told him to f*** off and leave her, her heart wasn't in it. Just like he'll know it with Robin, just like he'll know it with Sanji. And he knows that when she asks him for help, she has never meant anything more deeply in her life. For that, he will move mountains. For that, he will level fortresses, he will smite gods, and he will slay dragons. For love does Luffy do these things. People hype up the moment when the crew get together and go to Arlong Park as the best moment of this chapter, and I'm not going to say that it isn't awesome. It's badass as hell. It is absolutely certified, but this chapter belongs to Nami, and to her moment right here. Because this is the moment that a girl who has fought so hard and so alone for so long finally finds the strength and the courage that it takes to trust someone else to lift your burdens. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 82 begins the confrontation with Arlong, teasing us with the possibility that maybe Luffy will be in this one the whole time, fighting alongside everyone else. He's swinging the giant sea cow around. Wow, nothing could possibly go wrong. Foreshadowing. And in the emotional arc of the story, this chapter comes on the heels of a very low heartbreak moment, and so we get this as a moment of triumphant catharsis. The guys show up, kick everyone's ass, and Luffy gets a big swing on Arlong to kick things off. And the punch is probably the best panel in the chapter, but I do also want to call out Luffy's conspicuously blank expressions as he approaches Arlong, this enforced neutrality, especially in this panel that, if you look at it for a bit, it starts to actually kind of look a little bit unnatural. That's not really a neutral expression, that is a focused stare, and from Luffy, that's actually kind of scary. But right, the punch. It is not the most satisfying punch in the series, of course, that is on Sabaody, but you can see the shape of that punch predicted here, the way that Arlong's body caves into the blow, the way that he gets punched almost past the foreground. And it is funny to look back and see the evolution of how Oda draws Luffy punching a tyrant. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Hey, remember how I said in the last one that Luffy is in the fight right from the start and nothing can possibly go wrong? Yeah, no, Luffy stuck himself in a rock and got tossed in the ocean. Everything went wrong. But it's really just an excuse to get him out of the way so that his crew can shine, which they do. Sanji has an amazing raised leggy pose with a cheering Luffy behind him. Zoro gets to draw his sword menacingly. And even Usopp once again saves the people of Cocoa Village by annoying a pirate so hard that he forgets about them. But the best panel is... like, there's some great action shots in this chapter, right? But it has to be this panel after Usopp accidentally launches Luffy into Chew, because it's just so... it's so good. It's the combination of Luffy's unbothered attitude, like he hasn't even noticed what's happening, and the wiggle, wiggle, wiggle back and forth motion that he's doing with the boing. It's just like, I can hear this comic panel in my head. I know just from looking at it, the exact comic timing of this moment, and it is so fucking good. Boing. Oh my god, I love One Piece. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 84 establishes the stakes for the first part of the fight. Zoro, Usopp, and Sanji are fighting the officers for the ability to save Luffy before he drowns. Dramatically, it's a very effective ticking clock, adding a sense of peril to what is otherwise, short of Arlong, a pretty easy stomp for the Straw Hats. And speaking of peril, whoops, turns out you can't actually be sliced nearly in half and just walk it off, Zoro. His wounds from Mihawk come back into play here, which I think is a lovely bit of storytelling, because it tells us that Zoro has been doing everything he's done so far in excruciating pain and refused to let it show, and oh my god, if that is not this man in a nutshell. I really like this panel, where Zoro's posture really shows that sense of exhausted determination just to struggle through, even though he shouldn't. Chopper would have been so mad at him. But the best panel is this one, because the dramatic lighting, the hunched over posture, that one sword arm almost hanging from his body, like, the title of this chapter is Zombie, and yeah, here Zoro really does look like a revenant, like something horrible that has come back from death to haunt the living world, which after Mihawk symbolically killed him, that is kind of what he is, isn't it? Which are the best panels in One Piece? There are certain panels in One Piece that have done something to me, and they're not necessarily the most spectacular or iconic panels. Sometimes there's just something about them. Chapter 85 is mostly about Zoro being a badass, absolutely schooling Hachi with one foot in the grave, making it clear that if not for his wounds, there's a decent chance he could have taken the whole Arlong crew by himself. Zoro's streaming wolf swords are especially gorgeous in this regard, with the trails of dust indicating both the graceful flow of Zoro's movements to dodge everything, but also literally showing that Hachi might as well have been slashing at smoke. But the best panel is... I can't even really say why, but it's this one. There's something about the way that Hachi's advancing flurry is rendered and the twisting acrobatic contortions that Zoro is making as he dodges and parries everything. I remember that I saw this for the first time back in the early 2000s when I was just a kid, a young artist, and something just flipped in me. I saw that approach to action, that approach to gesture and movement and motion, and in my head I thought, that's it, that's what I want. You can't always predict what will alter your brain chemistry. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 86 is Sanji's chapter, taking us through his fight with Kurobe in basically one smooth go. And it is structurally an extremely well-paced fight, establishing the stakes of protecting Luffy, putting our hero in an impossible situation against terrible odds underwater, and finishing it off with a satisfying climax when he overcomes the challenge. And Oda is on form with the action here, crisply rendering Sanji's surgical precision kicks, capitalizing on what was set up when he beat Momo. But Kurobe's underwater beatdown of Sanji also looks quite spectacular. At his flaming axe kick here, for example, look how stretched and distended Sanji gets while still having that sense of floating in the water in his posture. And I'm also quite in love with this panel of Kurobe coming in for a palm bomb. His webbed hand in the foreground and the charging palm behind it is good composition, and that expression is just excellent. But the best panel is probably this one, as Sanji tries to flee to the surface for air. The perspective pulls back into the deep water, showing him tiny next to the vastness of what he's swimming in. It's a classic way to depict powerlessness, and it shows quite literally how out of his depth he is. Good craft. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 87 is Usopp's chapter, opening with him playing dead rather than fighting to escape from Chu. An underappreciated aspect of Usopp's lie-telling is that there's no one on Earth he lies to more than himself, so as he covers himself with dirt so he can pretend like he fought hard, he tells himself lies about how cool everyone is going to think he is when he gets back. And as Usopp rubs dirt on himself, this lie of battle damage, he visually becomes more and more pathetic, and sinks in on himself as the shame begins to rise. The best panel, therefore, is this one, of Usopp sitting there on the ground, tiny in the frame, small and shrinking as he remembers the courage of everyone else in the battle. He looks as small and childish and helpless as he feels. It's a panel that does a very good job of putting us inside his perspective, helping us to understand him in a way that keeps us sympathetic to him rather than annoyed by him. Usopp is the one who doubts himself the most of all the Straw Hats, and his journey is about learning to believe that he can be the man that he's always lying about being, and that's a journey that has to start at the very bottom. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 88 is all about setting up the moment that Luffy gets back in the fight, but it's also about Nami. As she confronts Arlong, he tries to pull his exact old tricks on her, telling Nami to sacrifice herself to save everyone else in the village, just like he did when she was a child. But this time, she has the faith to refuse him and swear to die fighting for freedom. And it is the moment that she makes that choice that Luffy, who's been unconscious and half-drowned so far, suddenly springs back to life, almost as though Nami's faith empowered him somehow. How odd. And the best panel of the chapter ties into this. When Nami is feeling the despair wash over her of the impossible choice, the threat that Arlong is making, the power that he's asserting over her, she grabs the rim of the straw hat, and though she's dripping with the cold sweat of fear, this is where she finds the courage she needs. It's a little bit Saturday morning cartoon, a little bit, if you clap for Tinkerbell, she will live, but that's the point, isn't it? Hope, however childish, however unlikely, however unrealistic, hope is worth dying for. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 89 is the turning point. Nami's faith has revived Luffy, and Sanji swims down to free him. Meanwhile, Zoro gets two badass moments staring down Arlong while showing off his wounds from Mihawk, and he does the classic "you are already dead" on poor Hachi, whose wounds open up when he tries to interfere. Nojiko gets a self-sacrifice moment, Luffy gets some great action panels kicking Arlong around. It's cool moments all around with high-powered shown in action, yeah! But the best panel isn't any of those, because Luffy extends his arms, grabs Zoro away from Arlong, and very cheerfully swaps places with him, and that is the best panel. Luffy tumbling towards Arlong after yeeting poor injured Zoro with that trail of following him into the sky. The running gag of Luffy getting Zoro hurt with the total confidence that his vice captain is gonna be fine is just, it's so good, and it pays off so well in Thriller Bark. I love that part of their dynamic. And it's a well-composed panel besides, with Arlong in the foreground, Luffy in the middle, and Zoro in the background. There's a fisheye effect lens on the ground, and the perspective of the shot leads the eye. It's good craft, but mostly it's just funny. Which are the best panels in One Piece? One of the underappreciated things about Luffy's fight with Arlong is that for most of it, Luffy isn't taking him even a little bit seriously. Arlong stands there pontificating about racial supremacy, and Luffy simply aggressively refuses to give a shit, cheerfully playing games while Arlong tries to kill him. His only moment of seriousness in this chapter is yelling out a really important theme of the whole story. I can't navigate, I can't cook, I can't do anything by myself. I need other people, but what I can do for them is kick your ass. To each according to their need, from each according to their ability. That's what being a pirate crew means to Luffy. Now, besides that, there's a bunch of excellent action panels in this chapter. Luffy shattering Arlong's teeth is a standout, but the best panel is actually the last one of the whole chapter, right after Luffy tricks Arlong into attacking his own man. Because it's Luffy with a hand on his chin, eyes conspicuously looking away from Arlong, a cheek squished over his mischievous monkey grin, saying out loud to himself, "Hey, I just thought of something fun." It primes us to wonder, hey, what would happen in this fight if Luffy took it seriously? And that is a thought that's gonna pay off. Which are the best panels of One Piece? Chapter 91 is the meat of the fight between Luffy and Arlong, and Luffy, as is his way, continues to refuse to take it seriously at all, even to the point that he takes some nasty wounds in return for playing with a shark. It's almost as though he's not here just to beat Arlong, it's as though he's really after something else, And one little background detail I appreciate, by the way, is that the hole Kurobi made in the wall when Sanji kicked him through it is consistently rendered in the right place throughout the chapter. It's the kind of detail you could easily leave out, but it's fun that Oda and his assistants took the time to get it right. As for a best panel, though, we've got a lot of strong action to choose from. Luffy power slamming Arlong after getting bitten is a strong contender, but I think I like this one better. Because Luffy's cartoonish dodging is a lovely little bit of acting. It shows off his personality as a fighter, first of all, but it also makes me wonder how weird it must be to watch him fight someone like Arlong, and it reinforces, once again, that Luffy doesn't take a villain seriously just because he's scary and loud. It takes something else to push him over that edge. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 92, the fight finds its way into Nami's prison, the map room. Luffy looks around and begins to understand what this room means to his navigator. He sees that her pen has blood on it, and when Arlong speaks about Nami as a tool, an object, a thing to be used, that's when Luffy finally stops playing. And it's tempting to say that that is the best panel. Arlong's hard metal saw held in Luffy's hand like a vice grip, the symbol of his shark teeth shattering under Luffy's fingers when he decides to crush injustice. But I think the best panel is this one, the moment before, when Arlong has his saw at Luffy's neck and he's shouting his monologue, and Luffy just looks at the pen. Arlong doesn't matter, the saw doesn't matter, the danger doesn't matter. Luffy was never here for Arlong. The thing he was really after, the thing that really mattered to him, was to find a way to save Nami. And now that he's finally looking at it, nothing so petty as a villain is going to distract him. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 93, the final panel is a pretty strong contender. Arlong Park exploding from Luffy's battle axe in spectacular fashion, albeit, once again, the Viz Media translators cover up too much of the art with sound effects, and it makes the scene a little bit less readable than I'd like. But you know me, I'm a sucker for storytelling, and as Luffy says to Arlong with shark teeth in his neck right before he breaks that unbreakable nose that Arlong is so proud of, I don't care about your plans, I finally found a way to save her. And this panel is that idea made manifest. Nami's hated desk, her prison, launched into the air with Luffy's footprint cracked into the surface. Luffy doesn't just defeat villains, he crushes their dreams, and in order to save Nami, he has to crush her nightmares. The desk here is rendered as this static object shadowed against an empty background, and there's almost a sense of time slowing down, a sense of Nami's perception narrowing, and all other things vanishing as she sees the desk falling and begins to realize what it means and what Luffy is trying to do for her. Arlong's defeat is the cherry on top, but this is the moment that Luffy sets her free. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 94 begins the denouement of Arlong Park. Storylines are wrapping up, and of course, Luffy is getting his very first bounty poster. And it is very funny that he was clearly smiling and waving at the photographer, rather undercutting Nezumi's rambling about a dangerous and bloodthirsty pirate. It's also very funny that Luffy manages to injure Zoro again with rubble falling from the building, and it's funny that Nojiko dodges a hug from Sanji to hug Mr. Genso instead. The villagers running off to spread the good news are bursting with a joy and energy that is a genuine hallmark of Oda's art, which I enjoy a lot, but the best panel is, it's Nami smacking the absolute fucking shit out of Nezumi. Not only is it a profoundly satisfying moment narratively, but Oda renders the twist of her swing in an extremely stylized, distorted perspective, which genuinely works like absolute gangbusters. The swoop and sway of Nami's arm flowing into her hip and down into her thigh is such a dynamic action curve, and the extreme distortion on the staff makes the hit look so loud and hard and so goddamn satisfying. I love it when One Piece gives a shit back what he deserves. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 95, we get the classic One Piece goodbye scene, and as always, the Straw Hats will do their very best not to leave as heroes. But first, there is the party, and again, nobody draws a joyous party scene quite like Eiichiro Oda. They are so full of life and movement, they are always so fun to look at. There's also some strong emotional beats, like Nami getting a tattoo with a pinwheel and a tangerine, and Genso's pinwheel sitting at Belmare's grave, both potent symbols that Nami has grown up and is taking her village with her on her journey. But right, the goodbye. Nami dashes through the crowd of grateful villagers and steals all of their wallets, which lets her leave on her own terms, cussed out and beloved in the same breath. And the best panel is this one, because in this panel we get just a glimpse of Nami's expression otherwise hidden behind her arm. Her eyes are screwed up and tense, almost on the verge of tears maybe, and it gives us a real sense of how hard this is for her and how much she needs for this not to be drawn out and emotional. If she didn't do it so fast and so rudely, she might not have been able to do it at all. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 96 is an interstitial chapter leading us into Loguetown, and here we encounter Tashigi, who is not Kuina, but who, well, at least in theory, is a great starry-eyed idealist foil to Zoro's brutal pragmatism, even if One Piece never actually really develops their relationship properly. We get to see Shanks again, too, who the story puts on the power level of Mihawk here, very effectively elevating and mildly retconning him from Luffy's fun, inspirational pirate friend to a world-tier superpower in just one quick move. It also takes the time to establish the dynamic aboard the Merry now, with sensible Nami buying newspapers to stay informed, Luffy goofing off, Sanji being a simp, and Usopp getting Tabasco sauce in his eyes, which is so fucking funny. The comic timing of that gag is just perfect. But the best panel, the most impactful one, is this one. The Navy Armada with their sheer white coats dramatically posed with the word justice painted on their backs. On the surface, it just communicates that the Marines are about to be a real threat, a higher grade of enemy. But also, from a broader perspective, the visual language isn't being subtle here, that these guys are the enforcers of an authoritarian military dictatorship. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 97 has quite a lot of cool moments to pick from. Luffy standing before the execution platform, for example, with the world vanishing around him and wind blowing across the screen is a great visual, telling us how momentous this feels to Luffy, but also giving us, the reader, a sense of unfolding destiny as he looks at it. It's also a good character moment in the sword shop when we find out that Zoro has absolutely no idea how famous or powerful the Wado Ichimonji is. He just knows it as the blade upon which he made his promise to Kuina. I also love the blood-soaked Kitetsu floating in front of chaotic violence as the shopkeeper tells the story of its curse. That's really nice and spooky. But the best panel is the sword drop. Of course, it's the sword drop. This slow moment suspended in time with the blade ever so barely missing Zoro's arm. It's a demonstration both of Zoro's supernatural courage and resolve and his idiotic recklessness in the face of danger. It's a perfect character moment for him. But it also tells us that luck, supernatural, incredible luck, is a power that defines him as a character, and look out for that as the story goes on. Which are the best panels in One Piece? Chapter 98 really wants to wrap up Loguetown by Chapter 100, so things escalate rather quickly. Alvida and Buggy return as a things coming full circle coda to the East Blue Saga, and they are set up as a kind of Team Rocket recurring villain team, which unfortunately never really goes anywhere later. And Smoker similarly gets introduced as a kind of recurring marine adversary for the Straw Hats. Luffy gets instantly trapped on the execution platform to die, and that gives the story an excuse to start moving really rather fast, and maybe too fast, frankly. I can understand wanting the 100 chapter milestone, but the anime made a good call building out a little bit more connective tissue in this part. It is a little bit rushed. The best panel, though, is this one, Smoker paying for the little girl's ice cream. First of all, because it lets us know that he's not the brutal scumbag that Nezumi or Morgan are, but also, kindness to those who are ostensibly beneath you is a key heroic trait in One Piece. You cannot be a hero unless you have it. So this is also the story signaling that Smoker might not be quite as much of a marine bastard as the world government want him to be, and that does pay off a lot later. Which are the best panels in One Piece? In Chapter 99, let's not beat around the burning bush, it is the lightning bolt. Once again, Viz Media covers up a bunch of the art with sound effects which grumble, 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 but between the brilliant use of hatching on the sky to suggest the volume of huge, heavy storm clouds and those stark, hard shadows on the buildings, you get a real sense of a moment lit in absolute celestial brilliance, a moment of epic significance. There's great thematic weight, of course, in Luffy toppling the execution platform where Goldie Roger died, but as several of the characters call out directly, the incredible timing of that lightning bolt at the very last second, and the rain and the wind almost calculated to give the Straw Hats cover to escape, suggests that this is more than just luck. It is almost as though there's some kind of divine power at work, weighting the scales of destiny, and like, wow, imagine that, some kind of divine power residing with the Straw Hats? What a concept! But anyway, bonus call out for this panel, Luffy apologizing to Buggy with his foot on his head and that expression, because that's just fucking funny, man. Luffy sucks at lying so fucking bad. You know, in hindsight, when the first 100 chapters of the story turned out to be merely the very prologue of its introduction, perhaps we should have expected One Piece to turn out as long as it eventually did. Looking back at Chapter 100 now, though, so much of what it seems to be setting up eventually just got kind of dropped from what the story turned out to actually be. For example, I still mourn that the rivalry between Zoro and Tashigi never really turned into anything real, because that seems to be the only thread in the story that has ever really confronted him with the memory of Kuina. Zoro, great as he is, has lost out a lot in the character backstory department as time has gone on, and it's a pity. Sometimes it feels like he needs a little bit more development. I also mourn that Buggy and Alvida never got to be true recurring antagonists. The story has Smoker capture them easily to demonstrate his power level, and introduces some of the anti-devil fruit tech the Navy now has access to heighten their threat level. But then, Team Rocket, like Buggy and Alvida, escape with the promise of hunting the Straw Hats all the way to the Grand Line. And I don't know, it would have been fun to see them pop up as a duo more. Buggy's story turned out to be amazing, of course, but I feel like Alvida would have been a fun comic partner and foil for him along the way, in a way that she never really got to be. Speaking of Smoker, by the way, he is theoretically an amazing antagonist for Luffy. His Logia powers, first of all, are completely immune to Luffy's blunt force attacks, and thematically they resonate by acting as a constraining, enveloping, all-encompassing, capturing force, the perfect representation of Smoker as a foil for Luffy's desire for freedom. He's also a good antagonist because he's much more like Luffy than he would probably care to admit. He does whatever the hell he wants, his orders be damned, and that instinct for freedom, well, it could have made him a very interesting rival and an equal opposite to Luffy, although that role, of course, will eventually be filled by a much darker enemy. I do like that it is a dragon who sets both the Straw Hats and the Buggy Pirates free to go on their journeys, and that, reading between the lines, his interference might even be the thing that sets Smoker off to chase them down. I've talked a lot about how Luffy sets people free to pursue their dreams, and I guess he's not quite alone in having that particular quality. Although also, even in 1999, it was really cheesy to have Dragon turn up wearing the "I am a mysterious figure whose importance will be revealed later" cloak. Like, One Piece usually has better character design than this, and for all that he's mysterious and spooky and raises a lot of interesting questions, Dragon just doesn't look at all interesting here, which is a pity. The best panel of Chapter 100, though, that's actually kind of a hard call, because the 5-foot promise on the barrel of grog is iconic as hell as a One Piece moment. It's a fitting final oath taken by the Straw Hats as their adventure truly begins. It's a reaffirmation of their shared purpose, and I like the goofiness that they do this with their feet. It suits them so well. But I do think the best panel is the final panel, the very last one. It is the Going Merry leaning on a rough wave, pushing through a storm with a glint of a lighthouse in the dark off in the distance. The Straw Hats here look small, but not powerless. The world looks dangerous, but also promising. And the sheer romance of a pirate adventure contained in the imagery of a small ship in a storm is simply too delicious to me to ignore. And besides that, this panel is a genuine tour de force as a piece of artwork, too. Ignore the speech bubbles and the sound effects, and really look at the drawing of this panel, and you'll see the depth of space that's being created by those overlapping layers of waves. You'll see careful and tasteful use of hatching to give texture to the ocean and to the rolling volume of the storm clouds. There is a masterful command here of light and shadow. Oda is sometimes accused of just being a cartoonist or having an art style that's too simple or unrealistic, but panels like this one remind you that the man is a master of his craft. His technical skills are undeniable. The final panel of Chapter 100 gives me a peculiar feeling. The restrained realism of its artwork makes the moment it depicts feel almost like it could be real to me. I look at this, and I can imagine what it must feel like to be on the Going Merry. The cold spray of the ocean, the beating wind, the driving rain, the sounds of canvas and rope whipping around in the squall. When One Piece is goofy and cartoony, it allows for the suspension of disbelief. It allows you to accept its ridiculous antics and go along for the ride as Luffy inflates his muscles like a balloon or Zoro cuts a mountain in half. But when One Piece's art gets grounded and realistic, all of a sudden, at least for me, that distance disappears. The fantasy falls away just a little bit, and I start to imagine it as something that is more true. So in the final panel of Chapter 100, just for a moment, One Piece is real. Hey, thank you very much for watching. That was 100 shorts to get us all the way through the East Blues saga. Next up is the Alabasta saga, which is 117 chapters, so see you back here again in about a year and change, depending on how fast I go. Unless, of course, the views for the series completely collapse and I have to abandon it, which, that's the realities of content creation. I hope not, though. Anyway, I've already done the self-promotion earlier, so I won't bother you too much, except to say, hey, maybe consider subscribing to my main channel. I have an in-depth essay about Captain Kuro and his genuine importance as a villain to the story of One Piece over there. If you liked this compilation, you will definitely like that. Besides that, thank you very much for your time and your attention. Please remember to be kind to one another, have solidarity with those who are struggling, and may the tides of history wash gently over us all.